started just in the interest of time. I want to start by thanking Twitter for hosting and thanking MobileTea for the opportunity to speak, and thanking everyone in the room who is listening for doing that. I'm going to talk about Aurelia, which is probably the latest serious contender in the next generation of front-end application frameworks. And before I start, I just want to get a sense. I know it's a little cliche to ask questions, but it'll help me to understand how to tailor the presentation. How many of you have worked with ECMAScript 6 like a reasonable amount? You kind of understand ECMA 6 syntax. Okay, maybe like 25, 33%. So maybe I'll go a little bit slower on the code. Who am I? I'm Morris Singer. I'm the senior software engineer and the front end lead at Heirloom. We're a startup right near South Station. And this is where I give my 30-second pitch for our company and what we do. Not only because they were gracious enough to give me their slide templates, but also because I really love what we do, and I love the company, and I think we have some great leadership. We're very promising, and we're also hiring full stack developers, really with more of a focus on front end. And so I want to at least introduce the opportunity for anyone who's interested in speaking with me afterward. So what do? We focus on providing breakthrough productivity for developers and technical users via dynamic, malleable, and efficient infrastructure. This is a very well-milled sentence, but essentially what it is we're building a cloud operating system that allows business the ability to flexibly and with agility deploy cloud apps, cloud applications. And so this has been quite a problem for large enterprises to do on their existing infrastructure, and we're making that easier for them. And so we do that on the front end and back end with Node, Express, Angular, and ECMA 6 and Babel. So if these are the technologies that you like working in, you want to work in a startup and kind of get in on the ground floor, please talk to me afterward. So here's what we're going to do in, my notes are just disappearing. Here's what we're going to do in the next 30 minutes, approximately 30, 40 minutes. First of all, because Aurelia is relatively new, I think the first commit was in January, sometime around then. A lot of people probably aren't very familiar with it or what it is, so I'm going to put it in context and kind of stack it up against Angular 2 a little bit, but also put it in kind of historical context so we can see what some of the problems are that at least I think that they're addressing. Next, we'll review the technology stack that Aurelia is built on top of. And then we'll kind of roll up our sleeves. We'll get into some code, look at some ECMAScript 6. You guys will all be experts by the time we finish. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes for Q&A at the end of that. So let's start by talking about where we came from. I have a theory about JavaScript. And I understand that some people will disagree with this theory, at least in terms of JavaScript. The evolution of front-end JavaScript frameworks, and this is not exactly a chronological thing. It is kind of a little bit, but it's more a taxonomic thing. It's how I think about how the frameworks have developed over time and how I place them and categorize them. And I'll show you what I mean. So starting back here, gosh, times were very simple in the 20th century. You just let the server do everything, especially if you're a front-end developer. There really wasn't much in the way of JavaScript. In fact, there was none. There's a call to a CGI, which I don't think I've seen in maybe 10 years or so. And you just kind of let the server kind of return whatever HTML it's going to generate. And that's it. It's very simple. So then there came jQuery. So people wanted to be able to interact with the server without returning brand new HTML every time. It was basically harder than going to the moon until there was jQuery because of browser compatibilities. That was put behind a layer of abstraction. You kind of listen to events on the DOM and interact with your server in the background. It was nice. Then there was this. Anyone who's worked with HTJS or Sencha has seen this. I found this to be pretty hellacious. I did 2 years of work in Sencha. And the idea really was I think essentially we hate HTML. We're going to build everything in JavaScript and use the engine to compile HTML. So you'll just write everything in JavaScript, including the client-server interaction, management of data. Not that great. Backbone, kind of the next thing that, at least in my acquaintance with these frameworks, came along. This was really the first framework that I think separated HTML and JavaScript into their proper roles in a modern web app. It said that you're going to handle your data model entirely in JavaScript rather than kind of gobbing data onto the DOM in different places. And you're going to let HTML kind of do its own thing, and you can write HTML however you want. And Backbone was pretty nice. Then there was Angular, which I actually love. I feel like Angular 1 is probably about as good as it gets for ECMAScript 5. Real separation of concerns, dependency injection, there's data binding, two-way data binding. I know there's some criticisms of that. It's well architected, and it's been really great. But it's been fairly opinionated. It comes with performance problems, especially because not everything needs to be bound two ways. There are some issues with flexibility, and the syntax, I mean, we can kind of wrap our heads a little bit around services versus controllers. I still talk to a lot of developers who don't understand the difference between services, providers, and factories. And as soon as you get into really anything complicated like ng model controller or Angular decorators or any of that stuff, the syntax can get a little bewildering. So this is kind of this year's wish list for me, and this is what I think some of the newer frameworks are going to try to address, is these issues. So I'm not an Angular 2 expert yet, but I understand that if I'm giving a talk on next generation front-end frameworks, I don't at least address how it stacks up against Angular 2, there will be people in the room who will feel that I have not done my job. So we'll do a line-by-line comparison here of at least part of what would be your application, just kind of your app.js, your main JavaScript file, either Angular 2 or an Aurelia. And this actually this was adapted from a set of code samples that Rob Eisenberg, the guy who founded Aurelia, that he put together. And it's of limited utility here, just to measure things in lines of code and say, well, Aurelia has fewer lines of code, so therefore it's better. I don't want to have us go there exactly, but we can glean a little something from this. So first of all, in Aurelia, you wouldn't have some of the dependencies that you have in Angular 2 just to get your app bootstrapped. This one's a little small, I apologize. Your application is defined actually on the DOM rather than in your JavaScript, so you don't need to actually use any of these dependencies to define your template for your application. You don't need to say what the name of your application is. It's by convention, you can modify it if you want, but you don't need it. There's already 3 lines of code out the door just to get started. And down here at the bottom, we have a couple of functions on the Angular side that manage, what this is doing essentially is concatenating a first and last name. And we have functions on the Angular side that will update the full name if the first and last name are changed. There are reasons why, if you were to look at how this is actually bound in the DOM, you need to do it this way, versus on the Aurelia side, you can actually use the getter, a JavaScript getter, which I don't think many people are using, but you can use JavaScript getters and setters in Aurelia, and it will manage updating the full name because it's just a JavaScript getter. So that's one example. I'm actually getting ahead of myself here. One thing I want to mention is that I think we can take Aurelia somewhat seriously. I feel like there's some risk with not having Google's imprimatur on a front-end development framework, but Rob Eisenberg, who founded Aurelia, he was on the Angular 2 core team for some time, and he left So I don't presume to know why he left, but I imagine it probably had to do with philosophical differences around the way that the framework was being put together. So there is kind of this aspect to Aurelia where you can look at it and see kind of maybe what Angular 2 might have been had circumstances been different. And then the other thing is that you're getting a framework that's developed in the context of having a fairly uniquely intimate understanding of Angular 2. And I think that should help people, I think, to feel a little bit more secure using this on a project. So, sorry, I gotta go through this again. Let's talk about Aurelia's technology stack. I've kind of divided this into two halves here. There's kind of a tooling half, and there's an actual application half. The tooling half is in Node.js. So this is your build processes, this is minification, this is putting things into being production ready. It's also front-end package management with JSPM. And on the application side, because you're writing in ECMAScript 6, everything is put through Babel, the ECMAScript 6 to 5 or ECMAScript 7 to 5 preprocessor. And we'll talk a little bit about that. There's SystemJS, which is a set of extensions for the ECMAScript 6 system module loader that allow the module loader to load CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. And there's some additional functionality around that. Aurelia makes use of that. And then finally, we have Aurelia sitting on top, which has its own packages, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So I don't know how many people get the Back to the Future reference here, but every time that I use Babel, I'm a little concerned with the fact that we're calling things ECMAScript 7, JavaScript of the future, where ECMAScript 6 isn't even really totally solidified, I guess, until next month. And so I feel like maybe what we're getting is an alternate timeline, an alternate version of the future, and we don't really know if ES7 will turn out the way that Babel is currently implementing it. However, it does provide some nice syntax, and Aurelia is a lot easier to use if you make use of it. Another thing, this guy, Bower, I have never had an experience with Bower that I found to be 100% satisfactory. It's always kind of been a little strange that like my dependencies get pulled into some random folder that it doesn't follow any of the conventions of the rest of my file naming, and it's kind of left up to me how I want to include the Bower dependencies in my project and to write build tasks that actually do that or to do it manually. And I'm happy to say that Bower is going to be dead in Aurelia. And no animals were harmed during the production of this slideshow, but it's been replaced by JSPM. So, Aurelia Essentials. These are the things we're going to talk about as quickly as we possibly can so everyone can move on with their night. We're going to talk about the packages that are in the Aurelia framework, along with a couple of optional packages that are very useful. We will talk about how to set up an Aurelia project. We'll go over dependency injection in Aurelia, creating templates. There are a couple different data binding modes we'll go after. There's a couple different ways of capturing DOM events and application level events. And custom attributes and custom elements, these would be directives in Angular speak. We'll go over how to create those, how they work. Application states, so routing, and then doing what everyone should be doing first. Last in this presentation, we'll talk about how to write some tests. And the reason I left it for last, I have good reason for it, just because it's hard to understand how to write tests unless you understand kind of what you're working with. So I left it for last, but we should develop them first, and I'm very serious about that. So, Aurelia framework. There are 8 packages. They exist in GitHub separately, and JSPM will pull them in separately into your code automatically. And you can rely on them being concatenated and minified for production by JSPM and Babel. I'm not going to go through them in huge detail, but they're the kind of things that you would expect to be bare minimum in a new front-end development framework. So we have data binding, we have dependency injection, there's a loader for HTML and CSS, templating, logging, a few other things. And I will distribute these slides through MobileTea, so you can feel free to examine this in more depth and go through the GitHub repos. I actually encourage you to look at Aurelia's GitHub page. So next, there are a couple of recommended options. So it's interesting to know that these things aren't part of the framework. This is kind of, I think, one of the main ways in which Aurelia does not overstate its opinions. If you want an HTTP client, if you want to use an HTTP-based data source, you can use it. You can use your own libraries. You may even find some way of using Angular's HTTP service. I'm not sure. I haven't tried it, but I like their HTTP client, and so I recommend checking it out. There's a router, which is pretty good, and there's an event aggregator, which is kind of like PubSub within your application. It's kind of, if you use your root scope.broadcast in Angular, it is kind of, it is their approach to eventing at the application level. So let's talk about getting started. And so I'm going to show you, there are just a couple of commands here to get started with your Aurelia project. The first thing you have to do is install Gulp and JSPM. Gulp is, for those who don't know, the JavaScript task runner that you probably should be using because of its speed and performance. Much better than Grunt. I've had much better luck reducing build times. And JSPM is the package manager. The next thing you want to do, JSPM is going to pull a lot of things from GitHub. So you're going to run into problems if you don't authenticate with GitHub. You're going to run into rate limits. And so you need to set up your username and password with JSPM for GitHub. Next, install, there's a Yeoman generator, so you can install Yeoman and install the Yeoman generator for Aurelia. This will pull down a couple of things. Get Yeoman's nice friendly output. And the last thing you have to do is run the generator. And let's take a look at what's happening. So this is the output from JSPM. You can see it's downloading a whole lot of stuff from GitHub, also stuff from NPM. JSPM can handle both repository sources very easily. Babel just downloaded, and then it's going to actually run your npm install. So there's a lot of stuff that has to install in Gulp. And in just a moment, this will be done. And the last step is that you have to actually fire up your development server, and this is how you're going to see your application. Really, it's just a Gulp watch. Watch task will watch for any files that changed and automatically redo the build. With Gulp, it's very fast. Let's see what we got as a result of that. This is just kind of the Aurelia scaffold. So you probably would never actually build an application quite like this, but it's nice to see kind of what you get out of the box and what some of the strengths are. So this is the kind of the classic. You get this the same demo with Angular. It's showing two-way data binding, event handling. This page is showing pulling data from a RESTful data source with the HTTP client library. And then the last thing is nested routes. So this is something you probably will use, but you won't do this. This is just for demonstration. They infinitely nested the routes, so you can see that it's a fairly flexible, powerful router. Let's get our hands dirty. Let's look at a lot of code. Now I have like 10 slides of code, so I apologize. This is coming out like 10 o'clock at night, and I know most developers work at 3 in the morning, so we're a little early. Actually, we'll be looking at code, but this is the entry point to your Aurelia application. So your index.html file, it's going to stay fairly small. Let's look at what it does. The first thing, I'll just shave away some of the stuff in the top and bottom we don't need to look at. The first thing that happens is you're defining your Aurelia application by name in the DOM. You can manually bootstrap it if you want. That's kind of a little outside of the scope of what I'm going to talk about tonight. The next thing that happens is Aurelia puts an emphasis on what static content you're going to display before Aurelia has bootstrapped. So I can't tell you how many things I developed in Angular before I realized that my users were looking at a blank screen for probably 10, 20 seconds, maybe not quite that long. Depends where I was working. And the next thing is you are going to include your SystemJS, which is the extensions to the system module loader for ES6 and the polyfill that comes in for ES5. And then config.js is this is where JSPM kind of goes above Bower. This config.js is automatically generated by JSPM, and it is responsible for actually loading your dependencies. So there is real dependency management on the front end with JSPM. Final thing here is you call system.import and you import the Aurelia bootstrapper, and that's really all you're going to be doing in your index.html. If you're doing anything else, I'm not sure what you're doing. Next, let's look at dependency injection. So this is really very heavily based on ES6. In fact, it is really almost purely ES6. You're going to import the Aurelia injector, and the second line that's highlighted now is using the injector as a decorator. So that's an ECMAScript 7 syntax. This is probably unfamiliar to most people, but this injector, you can actually use this as a static method in your class, but it's kind of annotation-like. Some people may be familiar with this from other languages. You call the injector, and you're going to inject your HTTP client, which was the second thing that you imported. So you're just importing your dependencies using ECMAScript 6. You're using Aurelia's inject decorator to actually bring them into your class. That third thing, my view class. And then in your constructor, you're going to pass it in as an argument, and it's order dependent. And then if you provide a reference to your dependency on your class, you can use it in your class methods. And there's a way to do this without using the ES7, dare I call it that, syntax, but this is actually really clean, and you might prefer to do it that way. I certainly do. Templates. Templates are interesting. In Aurelia, they're only specified inside of a template tag. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to specify what you're that you're writing a template. Then you can actually require dependencies. So this, I believe this is actually a kind of a lazy loading mechanism, because Aurelia is not going to encounter this until it actually pulls this template from the server. So it doesn't even know that it has to require this dependency until we get there. And then the third thing is you'll actually use that custom element that you just required in. And there's an example of binding on that. We'll cover that more in just a moment. In fact, we'll cover it now. So data binding is flexible, and there are smart defaults. So Angular 1 got a lot of criticism for having two-way data binding as being the only way to bind data. It's fairly unperformant. For most things, it's a little heavy-handed. There are many times where you want to pull in your data, render it into the DOM, and that's really it one time, or maybe you want to do it in one direction as many times as is necessary, but the data is only going to flow in one direction. You may have some times where you need to do two-way data binding. So with Aurelia, you actually can specify if you want two-way, one-way, or one-time. If you just use bind, it will just be a smart default, and I'll show you what those are here. So two-way data binding is the default for form elements. So you think about it, if you have an input, you may have that value of the input changed in response to some data source, and you may actually provide input on that form element that you need to update something on your data source. So two-way data binding is the default for form elements. You can, of course, specify anything you want. One way is the default for everything else. So you think about it, if you have like a P tag, you don't necessarily want to have, in fact, you probably don't want to have two-way data binding on your p tag because there's never going to be any user input going into that p tag. If you're depending on two-way data binding for a static HTML element like a p tag, I think you're probably doing something strange. You probably don't have to do that. Lastly is one-time data binding must be explicitly specified, but it's there. So kind of the use case for me that I think about is in my Angular apps, I do a lot of ng include just to kind of break things up into partials. I don't necessarily want to have things within some of those partials like a nav bar. I don't want to have those things linked with two-way data binding with my data source. Seems like it's unnecessary. Even one-way data binding, it's like once I know what goes in the nav, I know it goes in the nav. So this is a little more flexibility there. So events, there are a couple of different ways of doing events. The first is with an attribute called trigger. So here I have a button, and I'm saying when there's a click event, call this say hello method, which is on my view model. And so what this is going to do is it's just going to look for that method in my view model, and it's going to call it. So I could attach that to any button that I want. Let's say I have a bunch of things repeated through a list and I have buttons. I could certainly use trigger to put that button or to put the behavior on that button for each repeated element in a list. However, it's a little inefficient. So here's the example with repeats. And so you can imagine if I had like 20 or 30 of these list items and to have to listen for 20 or 30 events, it just seems like there's a better way of doing that, a more performant way of doing that, and in fact there is, with something called delegates. So here we moved the trigger up from the button to the actual, to the unordered list, and we changed click.trigger to click.delegate. And so now what's going to happen is anytime you click, and this is probably not exactly the way you would do it, but anytime there's a click on any list item, that handle clicks event is going to get called, and the event object, which is passed in, is going to have information on exactly which DOM element was clicked. So again, it's going to reach to that handle clicks method in your view model. It's going to pass the event in. It's fairly straightforward. The third thing here is application events. So don't use DOM events as a way of sending messages between different parts of your application. What you should do is use this event aggregator dependency on the second line, and you can subscribe to different kinds of events, and you can publish different kinds of events, and it's a great way to send messages across different parts of your application. I'll show you how that works. So first thing I'll do, it's not going to the next slide here. There we go. Okay, so inside of here, what I've done is I've injected the event aggregator. I've imported it. I just removed the line just for simplicity. And I've put a reference to that event aggregator on my class. It's kind of what we saw when we looked at dependency injection. Now I can use it. And the way I'll use it is the event aggregator looks at two hooks here on the class. One is publish and one is subscribe. And so if I publish, I can create an object with any data in it, and I can use the event aggregator to publish that data on any channel. And then any view model that I have that's using subscribe and is subscribed to that channel will receive that payload whenever that event is triggered. So advance. The other thing you can do, which is cool, I haven't really thought about how I would use this yet, but I imagine it's going to be useful, is rather than specifying channel names as strings, you can actually listen for certain kinds of objects to be published. And you could say, I only want my view model to respond if I'm publishing a special object in this case. That's the only time that I want to actually run my callback in response to an event. Custom attributes. So this is something that we've seen for data binding. It's something that you've probably used to use Angular. Attributes that are not part of HTML that you're using in your DOM as a result of something that you've defined in the framework. And the way that this works is you have to provide a definition for that custom attribute, just like you would an attribute level directive in Angular, and you can inject the element to which it's attached into the class. Let's look at this here. A few steps. So you can inject the element. So if I had that attribute on a div tag, that information about that div tag will be injected into my class and passed into my constructor. And then I can provide a reference to it on the object. And I can use the value changed hook in Aurelia to monitor for changes in that value. And so this is like in Angular if you were to use a watcher. In Aurelia, you use a value changed hook, and you could remove or add classes to that element or do other things in response to the value changing. So just to kind of go back here, so it would monitor the value in show.bind. So if it's is saving and then it gets changed to something else, what would happen is that value changed hook would be called. Skip through this. Yes, go ahead.
A lot of them. So Angular has the similarities with Flex, but Aurelia is a lot of them. You ever worked with a Flash platform? You see these similarities, and the only crazy guy that is looking into this code saying, "Hey, this was 5 years ago with Flex."
So that's an interesting point. I'm not terribly surprised by it. I mean, I think to some extent as the frameworks evolve, I think there's kind of there's a desire to take the best of whatever came before. So it's not terribly surprising to me that there are similarities with Flex. I personally haven't used Flex. I was really in another world, in another career path until after Apple succeeded in killing Flash. So I don't have a lot of experience with Flex, but it doesn't surprise me.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So custom elements. So this is an example of using a custom element. And we looked at this before. You require in your custom element. So that's going to require in the say hello.js. JS gets added. And then you can use it as an element down kind of the second line from the bottom. You can bind values to it. And so that's how it's used. But of course, it has to be defined. So the definition is it's simpler than a custom attribute. At least this one is. And the way that it's going to work is you import the custom elements decorator. That's line 1. And then you can use that decorator to define the name of your custom element. So when I say custom elements say hello, that means that I'll have a say hello HTML tag that I can use in my template. And then I can bind to any variable that I pass in on that custom element. So there was it was say hello, and then there was a 2 equals. The 2 was an attribute. It's been bound here, the bindable decorator, and then I provided a method here called speak, which actually uses that bound value. And the last thing you have to do in the case of a custom element is provide a template. So this actually might look like web components to people, but it's not shadow DOM, but it's got some similarities. You're providing a template for what that custom element is going to turn into when your templates are compiled. So it turns into a button with a click event, the speak method we saw on the custom element definition, and then there's that 2 bound variable. So one of the last things I'm going to talk about is application states. We're not going to get into a huge amount of depth on it. But the point I want to make here is if you're used to defining states in Angular with UI router, you probably are used to having learned a whole custom syntax with state provider. It probably, at least if you're like me, is something you get wrong like every time you do it, and you have to go back and actually debug, well, why isn't my state loading? And of course you get like rerouted to some URL that is like the default case, and it's kind of a nightmare here. It's just an object primitive. It's just an array with a set of objects inside of it. You're passing in the URL for your route, the path to a module that's going to handle that route, and a title for that page, and a couple of other attributes. So it's actually simplified quite a bit from the Angular approach, just an array of object literals. Last thing I want to talk about is test-driven development. So this has been kind of a whirlwind here tonight, just in the interest of time, but if you are doing test-driven development, first of all, if you're not doing test-driven development, you should be. If you're doing test-driven development in Angular, you probably spent a lot of time when you started doing it trying to figure out how the heck to do it. And that might have been the end for you if you didn't get past that. This has been the easiest experience I've had writing tests. And it's simple really just because it uses Aurelia uses the ES6 modular loader, and the dependency injection that is built on that is fairly simple. So there's not like a lot of custom framework APIs that you have to learn in order to get your tests working. And we'll look at that in a second. It's pretty straightforward. You're just going to mock your dependencies, inject them into the module under test, and you get to test behavior. So it's very straightforward. So here, I've mocked a backend. So rather than using the HTTP client that we saw earlier, I just have this stub here, which has a method on it that returns items that I can attach to this stub. It's fairly straightforward. You could actually just make this even simpler and return a promise to an array that you define in line. Then, in your test, you start by importing the module under test, and then you can inject your mock dependency in just by using, like, it says new myView HTTP. So I've just used standard plain vanilla JavaScript to inject my dependency into the module. Yes? This is Jasmine, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could use Mocha. It comes with Jasmine and Karma out of the box. I mean, you could use your own thing. You could use whatever you want. And the reason for that, the reason why it's easy is there's no like mock testing library for Aurelia, like you might have seen with Angular. So you don't have to worry about compatibility issues there. You're making a new, you're importing your module, you're making a new one, you're injecting your dependencies or your mock dependencies, and then you're just running assertions against them. So Jasmine, Mocha, QUnit, whatever you want. That's the last thing that I will show. So thanks for listening. If you have questions, feel free to get in touch. There's some ways to do it, and you can, of course, ask questions if we have time. Do we have time? Anyone here? I guess so. Right. Yes.
I mean, like you show the payload, which looks like it's like self-routing the message, or has nothing to do with it.
The payload can be whatever you want. So just to put some context around how I would use it, if I receive, I mean, you could have it with a WebSocket, for example. If there's new data coming across a WebSocket, then you could issue an application level event with the event aggregator with the data that came across the WebSocket, and then any of your modules that need to respond to that update of view could do that. It's very flexible. I mean, you really, the possibilities are endless, but I would probably use it with a WebSocket would be a common one.
So basically you're promoting some kind of properties that can be subscribed by someone else in the payload, right? Or
I'm not sure if I understand.
well, in the payload you have some kind of metadata, or it's something else?
Sure. So I mean, it could be whatever you want. So my guess is, for a WebSocket example, I would actually receive data on the wire, and I would publish that data as an event.
So you could subscribe to it.
Exactly. So if I have like a list that needs to show if there are new items coming in on the server, and I need to update that list in real time as new items are showing up, I would listen to that WebSocket, and then I would publish the data that came across the WebSocket as an event, and then my view model could respond to that by updating whatever it was that was bound to that list in the HTML.
And those properties can be public and private and, or whatever. Or
Yeah, those properties are passed in on the publish event.
Any other questions?
So can you talk a little bit about who's using Aurelia? At first time I heard about it was a few months ago, and I saw the fancy video on the website. So who's using it? Why should we invest in learning it? And touch a little bit about all the fancy frameworks that are popping up at mushrooms.
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question was who's using Aurelia and why should we use it? So I think the thing here is that there's been a lot of chatter about Angular 2. And there's really been no competitor to Angular 2, and that kind of worries me because I want to see. I mean, I think competition is a good thing. I think the best ideas kind of come out of competing notions, and so if we have Aurelia and Angular 2, and they're kind of proposing different philosophies around how the framework should be built, then I think that's a good thing. In terms of who's using it, I don't know anyone who's using it in production yet. It's very new. I'm not even sure I would recommend at this point using it in production, but I think it's definitely something that people should keep an eye on because I think that it has a reasonable shot at being a serious competitor to Angular 2, just based on what I've seen in the way it's built. Anything else?
Yeah. So the next question is, when you are going to do a talk comparing Aurelia and Angular 2.0?
When I stop needing to sleep at night, then I will learn Angular 2. Okay, yeah, no, it's. I mean, it's a good question. You know, my comparison with Angular 2 was very minimal in this presentation for two reasons. One is that I haven't had enough time to explore Angular 2. Kind of preparing one framework for a presentation was enough. But the other thing is that I think that we can only really do a comparison when people in the room are familiar with the frameworks that are being compared. So I think we should do that. I think it would be very interesting. But I think if we wanted to do it quickly, we probably would need to do something like a panel with an expert in each, as opposed to having one person who's just kind of like a guru of all of the ES6 frameworks that are coming out.
No. Are you serious? Okay. So, but my next question was, okay, pick up a couple of names and let's try to reach them out and let's make it happen. I think it should be something interesting for the community. And I'm a bullbuster, so I can push people.
Yes, you are. Right. Let's do it.
Yes, you are. Why people are saying yes? Okay. Thanks, Maurice.
Okay. Thank you.